welcome to the debate. So when you turn on your tap, you trust the water is safe.
Right, yeah. You expect clean water.
Exactly. You don't really think about the miles of pipes or the complex filtration mechanisms or even the governance protocols that made it that way. And we treat our professional lives the exact same way. We obsess over the resume, which is, the final tap, while completely ignoring the reservoir of our actual career history.
We really do. We just assume it's all there.
Right. But what happens when that reservoir runs dry? Or worse, what happens when it gets contaminated by an automated HR algorithm or, say, a bad manager's misinterpretation?
Exactly. And if the reservoir is empty or if the water itself is toxic, then, the most elegant plumbing system in the world won't save you.
Mm-hmm.
The pipes are secondary. The substance actually flowing through them is what keeps the city alive.
Which brings us to the core of our discussion today, drawing heavily from the curriculum of LPR Academy Module 3. The foundational premise here is, it's simple but radical. The resume was never the real problem in your professional life.
No, the problem is interpretation.
Precisely. Interpretation. To solve that, the material posits that every worker needs a living professional record, or an LPR. But where we diverge today is on, the true locus of the LPR's power.
Right, the real engine of the whole thing.
Yeah. Does its primary value lie in its rigorous structural architecture, the interconnected system of governance? Or does it fundamentally anchor on its function as a curated repository of tangible professional memory, like the qualitative documents and contexts themselves?
Right, because the material clearly states that the LPR operates as a system. But we have to ask what gives that system its heartbeat.
Right.
I'll be making the case that while the system framework is, an elegant organizational tool, the fundamental anchor of the record relies entirely on the qualitative depth of the documents and artifacts gathered. Over-indexing on the system risks obscuring the tangible human memory it actually exists to protect.
And I will be arguing that the LPR is strictly defined by its interconnected system architecture. Without the governed relationships between its components, a collection of professional documents is not only useless, it's frankly a liability.
A liability? Wow. Okay.
Yes, a liability. To frame my position clearly using the core doctrine of the material, a living professional record may use documents, folders, worksheets, templates, or software, but the LPR is not merely a document.
Mm-hmm. It is a system of relationships. It connects evidence, context, claims, privacy, renderings, and revisions. If those parts are disconnected, the client may have useful materials, but they do not yet have a functioning LPR.
Right. They just have files.
Exactly. A resume is not the record. A folder of evidence is not automatically the record. A LinkedIn profile is not the record. The record is the governed source system beneath those outputs.
Well, I come at it from a different way. I acknowledge that a disconnected pile of artifacts isn't the final goal. The curriculum explicitly warns against treating your evidence like a hoard.
Right, no hoarding.
But the system is entirely subordinate to the material it holds. The text points to starting with a minimum viable record, just using basic everyday templates to capture your weekly wins and challenges before you even think about building out a complex database. True. It does start simple.
Right. And that proves the true defense against professional erasure isn't some abstract relationship. It is the tangible preservation of human truth found in the evidence vault, the context layer, and the decision and judgment log.
Okay, but
without these foundational documents capturing the qualitative reality of the work, the system is an empty shell. The system organizes, yes, but the documents remember.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. Memory without governance is incredibly dangerous in a professional context.
Dangerous?
Yes. Let's look at how the material strictly separates the anatomy into two distinct hemispheres, the source layer and the rendering layer.
Mm-hmm.
The source layer is private by default. It contains all that messy reality you mentioned, evidence, claim maps, privacy boundaries, AI provenance. The rendering layer contains purpose-specific outputs, so a resume, an interview answer, a portfolio description.
Sure, the public-facing stuff.
Right. And the system's most crucial feature is this structural boundary. The material states, quote, The client renders what belongs in the moment.
Right.
Going back to our water filtration analogy, the reservoir, the source layer, is vast, heavy, and strictly governed. But the tap, the rendering layer, only delivers exactly what is needed for a specific audience.
Yeah. You wouldn't want the whole reservoir coming through the tap.
Exactly. The architecture itself, the mechanism that prevents the private source from bleeding indiscriminately into the public rendering, is what makes the LPR work.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that the most vital parts of this private source layer are distinctly document-heavy and qualitative?
How so?
Well, when we look closely at what actually lives in that source layer, it is fundamentally a documentation exercise. Take the roll record and the project record.
Okay.
Let's say you're an operations manager who navigated a massive supply chain crisis during a corporate merger. Your official title is incredibly thin. Your resume simply says, Manage Logistics.
Right. Which tells you nothing.
Nothing. And in today's market, an automated HR filter deletes your application because you don't have the keyword, synergy or agile.
Which happens constantly.
Exactly. So how does the LPR prevent that erasure? It requires deep, descriptive, human documentation. The project record captures what the text calls operational texture.
Mm-hmm.
It forces you to write down the constraints. The vendor dropped out at 3 a.m. The budget was slashed by half. The actual chaos you navigated.
Right. The reality on the ground.
Yeah. This isn't just about moving a piece of data through a systemic pipe to a tap. This is qualitative substance. The power to bypass that HR filter and prove your worth to a hiring manager comes from the hyper-specific reality captured in those documents. That is the lifeblood of the LPR.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. I agree that operational texture is vital, but how is that chaotic 3 a.m. vendor crisis protected from misuse?
What do you mean?
Well, how do you stop the worker from inadvertently inflating their role or an employer from misinterpreting it? It's protected by the governance mechanisms of the system.
Sure, governance plays a part.
It plays the main part. Think about how a career actually grows. You don't just magically possess a skill overnight. That's why the governance labels are the actual engine of the LPR.
Okay.
Consider the claim status guide. The material teaches that a claim must be labeled with its maturity status. If you just started using Python to fix those supply chain models, you tag it emerging.
Right.
If you used it to build a company-wide app, it's verified. If you want to learn it next year, it's aspirational.
But the label itself doesn't do the work.
It does mechanically because it stops the worker from accidentally inflating their resume, getting hired for a job they can't do, and getting fired 6 months later.
Well,
It also prevents them from forgetting a skill they are actively building. And then consider the privacy layer. You might have an amazing document detailing that merger in your evidence vault, but the privacy layer dictates whether it is public, metadata only, redacted, or strictly do not upload.
sure, privacy is important.
But the text states that privacy is not a later compliance step. It is part of the anatomy of the record. This system of tagging, mapping, and bounding is what prevents the LPR from mutating into a dangerous, permanent surveillance file. The documents are passive. The system is active defense.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Labels like verified or supported are entirely meaningless if they're applied in a vacuum.
A vacuum.
Yes, a vacuum. A tag doesn't protect the truth. The human narrative protects the truth. Let's look at the contribution record and the witness layer. The material warrants explicitly against two major risks, inflation and erasure.
Right, the two big threats.
Exactly. Inflation sounds like, I led the enterprise transformation. Erasure sounds like, I just helped out.
Mm-hmm.
How does the LPR actually correct this? Not by magically slapping a supported label on a blank page. It corrects it by forcing the worker to document specific, undeniable human actions. The evidence shows I created the checklist, coordinated manager input, and became the point of contact.
But those actions have to be mapped to a claim.
They do. But the foundational value is the action itself. Furthermore, look at the witness layer. Not all evidence lives in documents. Some lives in people.
Right. Social proof.
Yeah. The system requires capturing who saw the work and what they can specifically support. The power lies in capturing the granular human reality of the contribution.
Okay.
I can hear people listening to this right now thinking, I work 50 hours a week. I don't have time to maintain a decision log, a context layer, and a witness layer.
It does sound like a lot of work.
But the curriculum anticipates this. That's why the minimum viable record works. You don't need a massive relational database to start. You just need to start writing down the truth. A governance label is just administrative wrapping paper around the profound act of preserving human truth.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the administrative wrapping paper, as you call it, is exactly what makes that human truth deployable and safe.
Deployable? Sure.
Safe, too. A witness note scribbled in a notebook is a memory. A witness note connected to a specific claim, gated by a privacy label so you don't violate an NDA, and logged for a future rendering, that is a system.
Okay, fair point on the NDA.
Right. Let's look at how this functions dynamically over time, particularly with the AI translation log. This, to me, explains the mechanics of why the system reigns supreme over the static document.
The AI translation log is a fascinating component, especially with how heavily we rely on generative tools now.
It is absolutely central to the modern reality of professional work. The material explicitly states, quote, AI assists, the human governs.
Right.
How?
Through the system. Let's say you use AI to draft a resume bullet based on a context note about that supply chain crisis. The AI translation log tracks the date, the exact source material used, the output, and crucially, the claims accepted and rejected. If the AI spits out the hallucinatory phrase, spearheaded enterprise synergy, the human can reject it as overstated, reverting to coordinated vendor logistics.
Right, keeping it grounded in reality.
Exactly. But it's the logging of that rejection that matters. By logging the rejection, the system forces the AI to remain accountable to the source material.
Yeah, it creates a paper trail for the AI.
It prevents what the text calls professional amnesia and invented claims, where a worker reads an AI-generated resume and starts believing they actually did things they didn't do.
Which is a real danger, a huge danger. Furthermore, if we look at Toolkit 5, the curriculum emphasizes that worksheets are not the final system. The prior tools capture evidence and context, but it is only the assembled, governed relationship in Toolkit 5 that creates the living professional record. The assembly is the LPR.
I fully acknowledge the brilliant utility of the AI log. Tracking provenance and preventing AI hallucination from permanently rewriting a professional's history is incredibly forward-thinking.
It really is.
But I have to push back on your ultimate takeaway regarding the assembly being the most important part. Having a perfectly labeled governance system with no actual evidence inside is like owning a state-of-the-art bank vault to guard a single penny.
Okay, that's a bit extreme.
But it's true. The architecture is flawless, but the asset inside is worthless.
I wouldn't say the system exists without assets. It's built to house them.
But look at what actually keeps the record living. It's the maintenance log. The LPR is living because of continuous human documentation.
Right, it needs updating.
The material demands updates after major decisions, after a role change, after a project ends, or after receiving feedback. It's the constant injection of new, qualitative human experience that keeps it alive. Take the decision and judgment log.
Okay, let's look at that.
For a worker in crisis response, or HR, or confidential management, their visible output might be literally zero. A crisis that didn't happen doesn't leave a paper trail.
True.
The only way for that worker to prove their value is to manually document the trade-offs, the constraints, and the ethical boundaries they navigated. That is an inherently qualitative, document-driven exercise. The system doesn't generate that insight. The human document does.
I see the emotional weight of that argument, and the decision and judgment log is indeed one of the most powerful concepts in this curriculum.
It really is.
It prevents judgment from disappearing into vague verbs like handled or managed. But let's follow your example of the confidential manager who averts a crisis. They write down the trade-off in their decision log. It's a profound qualitative document. But what happens if they just hand that document to a hiring manager?
Well, they wouldn't just hand it over.
Exactly. Because if they did, they'd likely be sued for breaking a non-disclosure agreement.
Right.
The moment you take an entry from that decision log, identify the maturity of the claim it supports via the claim status guide. Apply a redacted label via the privacy layer because it involves a confidential client, and map it to a specific interview answer via the renderer. Well, actually, sorry, you are no longer relying on a document.
Okay, I see where you're going.
You are relying on the system of relationships to protect you. Without the system, that document is a career-ending liability.
And I would argue that the system is merely the vehicle for the document's truth to safely travel. Let's look at the learning log.
Sure.
It isn't just a list of completed courses or a credential wallet. It tracks exposure, practice, supervised use, independent use, and mature capability.
Right. It tracks the evolution of a skill.
Exactly. It distinguishes between a stale skill and an aspirational direction. This requires deep reflection on the part of the worker. The material says the LPR begins with what can be supported, not with how someone wants to be seen.
Which is a key distinction.
Yes, that support is grounded in the evidence vault, which the text calls the entry point for professional proof. Without the source material, the work products, the project notes, the memory entries, the claim map has nothing to map. The system is starving without the document.
But the material explicitly warns that the evidence vault is not a hoard. You don't just dump every certificate and email into a folder.
No, of course not.
The advisor must avoid teaching clients to collect everything. It must be curated. And how do you curate? You ask system-level questions.
Like what?
Like, do we have the right to keep this? Is it safe to use? Does it contain third-party information? What claim might it support? This is governance in action.
Mm-hmm.
The curriculum is incredibly strict about what the LPR is not. It is not an employer-owned talent file. It is not a brag file. It is not a surveillance system. It is a private, worker-owned, governed source system.
Governed being the key word for you.
Yes, because the protection of the worker relies entirely on the rigidity of this architecture. If you treat it just as a collection of documents, you risk the very professional erasure the LPR is designed to prevent, because a pile of documents can easily be misinterpreted or weaponized by an employer.
I don't disagree that an uncurated pile of documents is vulnerable. Where we differ is on the primary locus of power.
Okay.
You view the architectural boundaries as the savior of the worker. I view the undeniable proof of human action as the savior. The material teaches a very specific phrase. Evidence comes before wording.
Yes, it does.
A claim is not proof. Proof is not permission. When a worker faces a labor market that increasingly relies on automated filtering and generic AI assessments, their ultimate defense is the hyper-specific, qualitative reality of what they actually did.
Mm-hmm.
The context layer, which captures the stakes, the resources, the before and after conditions, is what prevents a small but critical improvement from being dismissed by a recruiter. The system organizes that context, but the context itself, the deeply human story of overcoming a constraint, is what actually changes the mind of the person sitting across the interview table.
But they only get to that interview table safely if the privacy and rendering layers function correctly.
I mean, sure.
The architecture is the prerequisite for the story to even be told. This is why the material insists that the LPR is the source layer beneath the surfaces.
Yes, beneath the surfaces. And what is beneath the surfaces? Bedrock. The documents, the memories, the human truth. You can't govern empty space.
But bedrock without structure is just a landslide waiting to happen. The bedrock must be governed. So as we synthesize these perspectives, my position remains that the LPR is fundamentally the governed source system beneath all professional outputs.
Okay.
While it is undeniably true that qualitative documents, witness accounts, and context logs feed the record, without the systematic relationships connecting that evidence to claim maps, maturity statuses, and strict privacy boundaries, the worker remains highly vulnerable to misinterpretation. The architecture, the system of relationships, is what transforms a static memory into an active defense.
And my summary is that while the structural architecture is undeniably robust and absolutely necessary for safe deployment in a complex world, the true heartbeat of the living professional record is the preservation of human judgment, context, and tangible evidence.
Mm-hmm.
An empty system governs nothing. The power to fight against professional inflation, erasure, and AI hallucination rests fundamentally on the depth and truth of the documents within the evidence vault, the context layer, and the role record. The system organizes, but the documents remember.
I think where we absolutely converge today is on the profound insight from Module 3. The resume was never the real problem, interpretation is.
Completely agree. And we both find common ground in the doctrine that the worker must explicitly own this source layer and that evidence must always come before wording. AI can assist us in drafting, but the human must ultimately govern the truth.
Precisely. Understanding this architecture, whether you view it primarily as a governance system or a curated memory vault, requires continuous exploration of these concepts.
Definitely.
There is a vast amount of nuance in this material for anyone looking to truly take ownership of their professional history and protect their livelihood from algorithms and misinterpretation.
There really is. It forces a complete paradigm shift away from just polishing a single piece of paper every few years. It asks you to take your professional history as seriously as a company takes its financial ledgers.
It certainly does. We will leave it to the listener to decide which paradigm, the rigorous system of relationships or the deep reservoir of documented human memory, best anchors the truth of a professional life. Because when you finally turn on that tap to pour out a resume or an interview answer, you need to know exactly what is flowing out and exactly where it came from.